Greetings. I can see now that we're live. Hello, welcome. First, thank you to Books and Books in Miami and its visionary owner, Mitchell Kaplan, and Christina Nossi and Sophie Perez for hosting us tonight and for hosting our Democracy Book Club every month. And thank you all for being with us. I'm Rachel DeWoskin. I'm a member of the National Steering Committee for Writers for Democratic Action. I'm a novelist and a poet, and I teach at the University of Chicago. It's an honor to work with my fellow WDA writers. We are a volunteer organization devoted to working for democracy globally, and especially in the US, where democracy and free reading are under attack. WDA was founded in 2020 by a small but fierce group of writers. We've now grown to a robust international cohort of over 3,000 members and hundreds of partner organizations, libraries, booksellers, and literary communities. We mobilize writers globally. Some of our beloved speakers have included Margaret Atwood, Salman Rushdie, Ada Limon, Natasha Trethewey, Jiayang Fan, Javier Zamora, contemporary poets from Ukraine, scholars from Turkey, among others. We work to register voters, to connect citizens to their bookstores and libraries, and to host conversations about democracy, literature, and hope, like this one tonight. Please join us as a member if you haven't already. All you have to do is sign your name at our website, writersfordemocraticaction.org. At WDA, we believe in literature as what my friend and fellow board member Peter Balakian describes as a bedrock of democratic culture and literary language as a force of humanistic inquiry and cultural cohesion. Libraries are centers of engagement, both literary and civic. They are at the hearts of our communities, and we at WDA consider librarian frontline workers for our minds, imaginations, and capacities for empathy and understanding. So it's a joy and an honor to welcome Tracie D. Hall, librarian, author, curator, advocate for the arts, and executive director of the American Library Association. Tracie is doing powerful work fighting against political book bans and devastating budget cuts to protect Americans' free right to read. And as she often puts it, and we hear and echo and amplify, free people read freely. Welcome, Tracie. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight.
And thank you for having me.
It's a joy and an honor. And I want to start with Erasmus's idea that a life without books is unlivable, and your ideas about life with books, life without books, and your own life.
Yeah, so thinking about Erasmus, I'm just coming back, a lot of different legs of the trip, but I'm just coming back from Rotterdam, where we all participated in the International Federation of Library Associations. So in addition to the American Library Association, there are national library associations in almost every nation. And there we gather and we talk on a meta level about the issues that are impacting library services, the future of libraries and the library workforce, and other sort of adjacent issues. And of course, censorship, obviously occupied a lot of the satellite space. We are seeing, in addition to that, a lot of repression, just of the press, journalism, et cetera, all over the world. However, the U.S. continues in many ways to be a precedent setter. If there is any way to justify the repression of human rights, constitutional rights, usually if it's happening in the United States, then, it provides, really important talking points and reference points for the rest of the world. And so, of course, Erasmus, was a citizen, a resident of Rotterdam. And so encountering his thinking and the way that he thought about books as a pathway or conduit to civic engagement and civic dialogue was just very present for me, and it was very prescient for this moment. So two quotes I kind of hold on to, of course, is the unexamined life is not worth living, but also that a life without books would be unthinkable and unlivable. Is something that we have to wrestle with today because we are seeing unprecedented legislation, right? That is not just repressing books and certain types of themes in books, but is also limiting or in some cases wiping out funding for libraries, certainly at the school level, but increasingly at the public level.
I want to talk about that legislation, but I want to talk about counter legislation and, where the fights are being fought and how to fight them, and organizations which are already, fighting on the front lines. But I also want to stay on books just for one more minute, and libraries, because I think each of us has a set of childhood memories that are set in libraries. And I found this thing that James Baldwin said about the library on 135th Street, the New York Public Library. And I was reminded of it when you were speaking just now. And he said he went 3 to 4 times a week and read everything there. I mean, every single book in that library. Yeah. In some instinctive way, I knew that what was happening in those books was also happening all around me. And I was trying to make a connection between those books and the life I saw and the life I lived. Yeah. And I've been thinking about your work and censorship and trying to provide access to vulnerable communities, including human beings who are incarcerated, access to literature, because otherwise I don't think it's easy or possible in some cases to connect things that happen in books with your own life as you live it and as you wish you were living it. I don't think it's possible to inhabit the experiences of other human beings. So that's part of the unlivability, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, obviously we know that reading in and of itself, builds a certain level of empathy, right? It exposes you to the lived experiences, but also the ways in which, or the techniques in which people navigate those diverse and divergent and similar. And did I write this type of lived experience, right? And I think, one of the things that I think a lot about is, honestly, that censorship today is really a Trojan horse for a whole set of actions that would more broadly deny human beings agency. And that's why I think, when we think about like sort of, going from like in terms of magnitude, going from things like misinformation to disinformation to information disparity or information redlining, as I call it, information segregation, to things like censorship, which is a form of information withdrawal, right? When we think about information withdrawal, it usually is to disenfranchise. And that is why, as what has become so normative and so accepted is that people who are incarcerated would experience information withdrawal as a condition, right? So that, you think about when COVID-19, when the outbreaks were happening, most people who were incarcerated didn't know what was happening, even as they might have been relocated from place to place inside of the carceral facility. The why of that was denied, and that information had to travel underground. And then we also see, like when we think about mental health, oftentimes, you will see that depending on what the situation is, the person who might be experiencing especially an acute mental health crisis or a sustained mental health crisis might experience not knowing at all what is happening or the why, or even what the treatment options might be, right? And certainly any type of ability to decide is taken away. So I think that information withdrawal is also attendant to other things that are happening in terms of of denying voting rights, more broadly, or so like if you go back to the McCarthy era and you try to study sort of why that era lasted from 1947 until 1954, like almost unchecked. One reason is because people, no matter how long it persisted, they thought it was aberrant. They thought somebody else would make it go away. But the other thing about it that I think, unfortunately, Senator McCarthy was a genius of is it was the suggestion of being un-American. And what were some of those books that were targeted like right away? One, of course, was Thoreau's Civil Disobedience,
Right.
because it talked about protest. Robin
Yeah.
Hood, because it sanctioned wealth hoarding. And then, of course, books by Langston Hughes, Just Be Simple, of course, because the notion that the worker could have a critique about labor, which is, Just Be Simple, the protagonist in a lot of these books that were precedents for graphic novels. And then, of course, the comic book. Senator Joseph McCarthy hated the comic book because he thought that it broke down really, really complex ideas on a very sort of simple level. Couldn't stand that. And then also, Frankenstein, because there was, this consideration that, a woman might be suggesting that there would be some attempt to overthrow, a certain type of regime or power. And then even people like W.B. Du Bois, who suggested, of course, that there could be a talented tenth amongst Black people. And then anything Whitman, because, of this notion of kind of playing with notions around gender and this the expansiveness of humanity. And so I think that when we look at the books that are being banned today, is the same types of books, right? And at the base, it is not necessarily, I think, the content, because the people who are banning books today aren't reading them. That's number one. We can talk
Right.
about that. But I think it is the idea that there would be this notion of agency and power being held in different ways, and powers that could, in some ways, counter, the state in some ways. And so that's why I think what we're seeing now, what we're seeing now, we've seen before. But if we're silent and disorganized, we will allow for what happened during the McCarthy era: 30,000 books, right? Targeted, some burned, and authors and creatives like really put literally and figuratively on trial.
Yeah. That's a brilliant response. So how do we be loud and organized? I mean, let's talk about the legislating impulses and some of the successes and failures, the counter legislation, the book banning legislation, the unbanning legislation, and how we fit in.
Yeah. Well, there's plenty of it, right? So, right now, the difference is that, we have the ability to copy and paste policy, either way, in terms of
Right.
censorship or to counter censorship. And I think that those who want to counter, and well, actually, those who want to censor and ban books, really, it's a lot of extremist groups, behind this. But also, it has become such a really good way to get your name out there and to position yourself to run for office. Especially, if you are in a place where book banning is considered to be, pro-American or good for the family and those kinds of things, and even we see a hijacking in some ways of religion. And, of course, when we think about the First Amendment, in addition to, freedom of the press and the right to read and freedom of expression, freedom of religion is there too. And so I think, it is kind of brilliant, if you will, but it is really not true that, that most religious groups are for censorship. In fact, most Americans actually believe that censorship is a violation, of our constitutional rights. But again, they are a silent majority. So right now, we've got to get unsilent. We have, a group, I'm really excited by that. Join Unite Against Book Bans, www.uniteagainstbookbans.org, which is, ALA was the first organization to launch a national anti-censorship campaign. And we had this really simple notion of unite against book bans, because when we did some polling, what we realized is that a lot of people don't know really whether or not censorship is bad or good, that the word is so loaded and it's being used in so many cases to make one feel like you're a concerned parent or citizen, that that folks don't know whether or not censorship is good or bad, but they do instinctively know that book banning is bad. And so we really kind of broke it down. But one of the groups who was a member of Unite Against Book Bans, and we want everybody here definitely to sign up, is called Grandparents for Truth. And what they've taken is like, right? I love it. First of all, I want to be a grandparent. I don't have any children, but I really, if there's somebody listening, that's another conversation. But I just think grandparents, like they understand stewardship of human beings in a particular way. And so I think what they're doing is they're saying, if you are going to weaponize this idea of the parent and make it seem like parents need to censor, what we're going to say is that as grandparents, we need to make sure that our children are prepared to live and amongst others. And I just love this, and they're out there. And so I'm really, really excited by that. But again, we need writers against censorship. We need poets, because poetry, Gwen Brooks, we're in Chicago, Gwendolyn Brooks, one of the most banned poets of ever, period. And now you see Amanda Gorman, being banned, in ways, and we can talk about lots and lots of poets, comic book writers. I mean, I think that even within creative writing, we could break down by genre and look at the kinds of books that have and are being banned. And we need everyone to stand up and really go to the streets.
Let's do it. And let's take, I love the idea of coming in on top of something like Moms for Liberty with a wiser lineage-based Grandparents for Truth. Yes, Poets for Truth, Writers for Truth, everybody against book banning. That's also so interesting about the nuance of the word censorship and the lack of clarity around whether it's positive or negative. That also seems to me a task for writers. We're looking for what we can do as a scrappy collective, and what we can write, which isn't sloganeering or isn't just sloganeering, and how to frame these stories, how to say what's happening. There are teachers moving books out of their classrooms in America and putting them on the sidewalk because they're scared they're going to get in trouble. And there are children who now don't have access to libraries. There are libraries being defunded in Michigan, over a genderqueer graphic novel on the shelf. And I think, one thing is to take a page out of that book and legislate, to say, actually, we're going to defund you if you burn books, if you ban books. And another is to outsmart the sloganeering, come up with something better, smarter, more true. I mean, Grandparents for Truth is a true slogan.
Absolutely, definitely. I hope they're not checking cards, because I want to join today. I want to be like,
Well, if one of my kids ever has a kid, you can be a grandparent with me.
Okay.
I think this kind of thing should be a communal approach in any case.
Yes.
Like reading and like libraries. Let's talk about librarians for a minute too, because I know librarians have also been under attack, and I think in any case have not always been fully understood as the three-dimensional, fully rendered human beings that you all are doing the work that you're doing. So if you could talk a little bit about your own life and landing in this astonishing, position, and sort of what it means to be a librarian, what librarians feel like and look like and do, and then what you're doing collectively at ALA and beyond. That would be very useful, I think, for our listeners.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of good things in there, a lot of good questions I want to get at. And first of all, I just want to thank you again for your thoughtfulness and care in this conversation, because I can feel it, and so I can feel it, and I want to thank you and acknowledge that. I want to go back for a minute to a couple of things that maybe, so one thing I want to say about Illinois, and then also big up Michigan and New Jersey and other places where this legislation is coming, is that, there are, just as we have seen, and I'm just coming back this weekend from Little Rock, Arkansas, where, Little Rock not Little Rock, the state of Arkansas has actually banned Black Studies as AP courses, in high school. And of course, it's like flies in the face of the Little Rock Nine, who are very much alive and well, and a reminder when you see them that these civil rights struggles, of which this is one, because censorship and access to information, the late, great John Lewis said that he believed that access to information and access to the internet would be the civil rights issue of the 21st century. And then he literally, dropped the mic. And how prescient were those words? How prescient were those words, right? But I'm just coming back from Little Rock, where you see the Little Rock Nine having to live through the very violent desegregation efforts, of Central High, and only to see even mentions of their lived experiences, and they're still alive, wiped away, just wiped away, from the record, and considered contraband. That we're living in a time where books and the histories and lived experiences that they contain would be contraband should tell us that Bradbury and Orwell and others were not writing too far. We're already living in these times. Butler. I mean, that science fiction we got to take away and call it science fact, because it, we're seeing it, come to life. So I just wanted to mention that, we are seeing some new legislation that would ban book banning, and we want to see more of that, but we don't want libraries and library services to be seen as collateral, because some people really don't care. And I want to say this, and I want everyone to kind of think about this, as painful as it is. A lot of us believe that if the notion of the public library were something that we all needed to collectively decide on today at this phase in our history, collective history, in this country, that it would be something that would not pass. That it is, that just free access to information now is considered to be somehow scary and destabilizing to some people, even though so many of us rely on it, and so many people in our communities. Over 1 billion visits before the pandemic, just public libraries alone experienced, and there are about 17,000 public libraries in this country, more than outlets of McDonald's, and that together there were about 1 billion visits. So believe me that those who are trying to destabilize funding or delegitimize libraries or trouble the waters around libraries are doing that intentionally, because as access to the public services and as access to public space and the whole notion of the public good are being eroded, libraries are being kind of caught in that, in the way in which, like in the conversations in the UK around Brexit, was just much more less, well, maybe ideological, but also very sort of political and economic, a little bit more than ideological and religious here and all those kinds of things, and moral. But what ended up happening is that, we're not talking about is that the UK lost 25% of its public libraries. Mm-hmm. And most of those public libraries were in places that were, very much labor, workers, blue collar workers, immigrant, people of color, lower income in general. And so I just want to say that this is not sort of like let's see what's going to happen. We could lose the very institution that is considered to be one of the most trusted institutions in this country. And unless you live in a really rural community, is within reach of almost every resident. They're within at least 2.1 miles of a public library. And school library services, now we know that staffed and well-equipped school libraries are mostly found in wealthier schools. In Chicago, we have 513 schools, but only 90 have well-staffed and equipped libraries. In Houston, as we speak, there's an effort to remove the books from the school libraries and make those school libraries detention centers, right? And so I just want to sort of say that, because as you ask a lot of those questions, for every question that you've asked, there is not only a cautionary tale, but a reality that we could have never imagined even 10 years ago happening today, not being suggested, but happening. And I think libraries and schools are just sort of like and public health are just the first stop on a course that is really, really dangerous.
You know, hearing you say that and hearing you build the constellation, right? All of the connecting stars, the civil rights constellation of what it means to ban books and to deny human beings access to information, because of course that prevents them from agitating for change or
Yeah.
advocating for their own rights as individuals or as families or as communities. It makes me think that we need to just say the things over and over in as many and as nuanced a set of ways as possible. I don't know if people know the anecdotes. And I mean, I guess one thing we can do as writers is reach out to our memberships, reach out to our friends and say, tell Americans that this is happening. Tell people who don't know that in Houston, libraries are being turned into detention centers, that those are little kids who aren't going to have books. It's a real, tangible, practical nightmare. And, you know, I think of the, you know, sloganeering around censorship and the idea of, you know, kind of keeping the masses belly full and minds empty or something, this kind of reasoning where you prevent people from identifying their own situations. Or Frederick Douglass learning to read in that essay where he once he can read, he recognizes his own situation. And that revelation of, oh, this is the situation I'm in. And then you start to begin to figure out the distance between that situation and the situation that is humanizing, that's okay for you or okay for your family or your community. And then you try to close the gap, and that's change. And that's what I think people are so afraid of now. And so how do we do it? How do we flood the radio waves? How do we say what's happening everywhere? Like what are the outlets? I mean, there's Grandparents for Truth. There's United Against Book Banning. There's Writers for Democratic Action, where we're trying to be a clearinghouse. We're trying to help other organizations that are already doing this kind of work. And where do librarians go? Where do you guys gather to organize? How are you organizing?
Yeah, you asked about librarians. You know, right now it feels like, you know, librarians are like in a battle that, you know, most didn't ask for, right? A lot of, you know, like me, I thought that I might, you know, at one point do a PhD. I left grad school. I didn't go on for the PhD. I left after the master's degree because right when I was right in the middle of grad school, we had the Rodney King uprisings in LA, and I'm from LA, and my family had already lived through the Watts riots, and I really felt like I needed to come home, and I did. And I really worked, you know, I've always been really interested in working with communities where there's like a lot of people who are unhoused, because my own family experienced housing precarity, you know, at different points. And so that's not other to me. That's like a possibility. Even at this place, I'm probably middle class. But, you know, when I see somebody who is unhoused, and if I see them frequently, I try to know who they are and what in their name. And it's not because of any type of altruism, but it's because a keen understanding that, you know, I might be a couple of steps. That could be me. That could be someone that I'll need to know, you know, that we might need to figure out survival tactics together. And, you know, people in my family, we talk about how for each of us that is alive and well. So I came to librarianship because I was sort of figuring out how to make that jump to maybe using my interest in research and all of that, and to critical inquiry and using it like in my community, right? And I've just kind of continued that. And then I was connected. I saw low adult literacy as being part of the, you know, the cycle for people who are unhoused, not for all, but for many. And then I started relying on libraries and connecting a lot of the clients that we work with libraries. And then I saw in librarians like something amazing, that there was this vast intellectual capacity, and a lot of times a lot of education, but they were using it for the average everyday person. And I was like, I am that person, and also I am that other person. I want to be in that space, and that's how I became a librarian. But you know, today librarians are experiencing bomb threats, loss of jobs. You know, it's hard to read an article and not see a librarian who is you know, being removed because they, you know, are fighting for censorship or, you know, those kinds of things. And so it's a very difficult time. But at the same time, like, what can we do is that I sometimes imagine this. Recently, I've been is it time for another March on Washington? Is it time for journalists and librarians and writers and readers to come together and say, we will not live with censorship? You know, we will not live under these conditions. We will not normalize banning books. We will not. Like, so I think micro movements, because of course the civil rights era in that era did not start with the March on Washington. The March on Washington was a culmination of all of these multi movements that were happening across the country. So I think we need to organize on a local level. One, to say we won't stand for it, right? And writers have a very writers, and you know what, academics, I have to say this because I say to my friends, like, hey y'all, because I have a lot of friends who are in the academy, like, look, academic freedom is real, and we're seeing like a lot of shadow banning and a lot of repression and censorship happening in the classroom, especially in the post-secondary level. Like, let's stand up in that space too.
Yes, please. I think that's an amazing idea. And I think we should do that. And I also, I think about librarians and centuries of librarians connecting people to the books which will save them. And I think about school librarians knowing kids and knowing when a kid walks in and says, has anybody ever felt this way? I know no one ever has. And the librarian says, oh, here, read this. And it actually makes the difference between kids managing and kids not managing. That's actually what librarians do. So again, the idea that librarians are being vilified, it's totally unacceptable. And that counter narrative also needs to be shouted from the rooftops. And we need to write heroic profiles in courage of librarians and push as hard as we can against this narrative, which is untrue and unsafe and deeply demoralizing. And yes, a march on Washington and micro programming as well. I want to remind everyone who's here, thank you for the lively chat, and for every library, which I see Jackie Leiden just dropped in the chat. You can ask questions. Feel free to ask a question in the chat or to fill out the little question, the little blinking bar down here, and we will ask your questions of Tracie. I also want to talk a little bit about your own, the legacy of your dad. So Illinois Humanities wisely awarded you a beautiful prize. And I happened to be that day in the room. And, you did many things which were powerful and moving and brilliant. And one of them was tell a story of your dad. And I was thinking of the story just now when you talked about deciding to go into what's fundamentally a community-oriented version of a PhD, using your intellect and your kind of powers to be part of the community of librarians and people who need books. And the other thing you did was hand out shells. And I, because we're in this virtual space and because we're talking about books and books which are, both concrete and abstract, ideas, what they contain, what they are. I want to talk a little bit about your family, if that's not an imposition, and the legacy that your dad gave you, and then also that gesture of handing out those shells to all of the people in that massive ballroom celebrating you.
Yeah. Wow. Well, one thing for sure is it's uncomfortable sometimes, like being celebrated, or getting an award or like any kind of honor, because like as soon as somebody gives you something, like me, I'm thinking of 500 people who deserve it more than me. Right. And so I have a discomfort with that kind of thing. I kind of like in books, like in children's books, how they would have like the prince or the queen or the king or the, or whatever. I always wanted to be like the wizard, kind of like disappearing, I don't know. I don't want to turn this into therapy, but I kind of wanted to like, what's your wish? Let me help you out. And then I'm gone, and then the story continues. So I have like, even, in a role like being executive director, I want to do all of the things that can be of support. But I don't like that. Sometimes the ambassadorial, pieces, like the pieces that are more like, they're harder for me, honestly. And so for me, I felt like, to be given an award, and there was a lot of people who were honored, who just really needed to be and should be. I felt like, all I'm doing is doing what a librarian should do. Our mission at the American Library Association ultimately ends with to enhance learning and provide information access to all. And that is what's imperiled right now, right? But that is like that is our, in a way, Hippocratic oath, like to all. That's what when you go to library school, you sit down, and like within 35 seconds of your sitting down in a chair, what you hear is information wants to be free. That's one of the primary laws of information. And so like there's nothing that you can't even be about book banning or censorship. So like for me, I feel like I'm doing my job. So what I wanted to kind of do, and also I know that I'm, with all the other librarians who are doing that, is like the cowrie shell is, considered to be, it's like currency in Ghana, it's like the SETI, right? But it's considered also to be about abundance and prosperity. And it's given not just in transaction, but also in like a gesture of friendship and relationship. So I felt like in my family, the way I was raised is that you don't take anything without giving. Like you don't go to anybody's house without something, that kind of thing. And so I just did what my home training is, which is to try to give those gestures out before I spoke or was honored. But my dad, my whole family, a lot of are rascals, and like funny and like all these other kinds of things. But my family is also about service because my family didn't have a lot. And my father, just had a stroke 2 months ago now. And what was complicating him being able to deal with the stroke is that every Monday, my father has like he gives away food in a park in LA, and so he couldn't rest. He needed somebody else who would be able to go and distribute food. And like, he didn't want just like put the food down. My father is like, he knows, he wants the people who kind of like really might be in a hard way, to be able to get it. And so he, so that's what was up with him. So I'm kind of like trying to walk into my dad's hospital room, just trying to see like what's happening from Chicago. And there my dad is with his hand is not working, and he's frustrated trying to operate his phone because he's trying to call somebody to take over the food giveaway. And recently he had a bad setback, so I had to go back to LA. But I will share this for all of us because I believe a lot in hope. I've been really down about what's happening in terms of the censorship piece and how far it's going and how organized it is, and how no matter what our efforts are, it feels like it goes up a notch. So I'm working, my dad is like in and out of consciousness, and I have my laptop, by his feet. I'm still trying to work, and he kind of wakes up and he looks at me and he says, I have something to tell you. And then he goes back to sleep, wakes up again, and he says, protection. He goes back to sleep. And now I'm like, oh my, what? So I said, Dad, next time he's saying something about protection. And he waking up and going to sleep, he finally got a chance to say very cryptically, he said, your protection is our history, is what he said. And I'm like, what? And I'm holding on to that because I want to believe that in this business of nation making, in this business of trying to row, as Anne Sexton says, that awful rowing, I'm going to say towards democracy. I'm going to say democracy, that it is a project, but one of the things that we should think about is that our protection is our ability to, even when it hurts, to try to move towards a collective idea of what can be right. And I'm thinking about things like abolition, and I'm thinking about things like women's rights, and I'm thinking about the things we still need to do about reproductive rights and voting rights. But none of those battles have been ever won any kind of way without some huge showing of that we won't stand for less, and really going out into, in many ways, just going out there into the streets and saying, this is who we are as a people. We believe in freedom. We believe in justice.
Yes, and working and showing up. One of the things I found so moving about the anecdote about your dad was the idea that he woke up and wanted to know who was going to deliver the food. How was that going to happen?
Right.
You know? And I think, you know, it's a reminder that each of us, we're all doing a million things. I want to acknowledge that. And we could also be doing more. And we could be asking each other all the time, what can I be doing? How can I be helping? And then we can collaborate so that we get the huge movement. I want to just point to the chat because Julia Dillman, brilliant UChicago student, writes, I just emailed my elementary school's librarian this week to volunteer there. I'm excited to be back in that space and help some kids find books that will connect with them. And Lisa Lee, who's wonderful powerhouse of activity and action and justice fighting, writes, underemphasized is the beautiful and fundamental practice that libraries gently and urgently nudge us to remember that we can and must share. And we don't need to own everything. Possession is not the highest virtue. And sharing books helps us practice giving up that which is precious and sharing with strangers, putting us into relationship with strangers with books as mediators. Of course, we also love our independent bookstores. And if you have any dollars at all, you should spend them at your indie bookstore, buying books by writers. But it is true that there's something profoundly democratic about libraries and about the idea that the books are shared and that people pass them from hand to hand. I remember the little cards in the 1980s and 90s where you could look at everybody else's name. I used to study those cards hoping I would find some secret, you know, some person, some crush, somebody else who had once taken the book out. But there is a way in which passing the books from libraries is just, it's the core of a democratic environment, a way of sharing.
Yeah, definitely. You know, that's what seasons the book, right? Like, you know, in libraries, we kind of think that a book, you know, at least is going to circle about 18 times, right? Sometimes, you know, it might be 100 times. There's something about a book that others have read that for me makes a book even more meaningful. I always say that, you know, I'm a big library user and library visitor. One thing for sure I want to say that folks can do is run for your library board. You know, do that because right now what we see is that those who want to censor books are actually trying to train and set people up to run for school and library boards so that they can be pro-censorship. So, you know, let's counter that as well and use your library. And of course, the local bookstore is part of the ecology. When I first started my career at Seattle Public Library, and we used to have this independent a bookstore day where we would go around to different independent bookstores and buy books that sometimes indie bookstores might be like really recommending or promoting. That might be kind of like your indie sort of like your college radio station. You're listening for a band that might be local and maybe even like self-produced or like books that might be self-published. That was definitely a part of our exercise. So, you know, when we think about the campus, you know, obviously the independent bookstore and the school library and the public library and your community college and academic library, they all exist, you know, really in relationship to each other.
Yeah. So join Writers for Democratic Action. Join the Coalition Against Censorship. Join Grandparents for Truth, whether you're a grandparent or not. Run for your local library board. Volunteer at your school library or some school library. Set up one of those free libraries. I see those everywhere now, by the way. And I definitely feel like, ooh, this is a little act of delicious resistance happening. I see banned books in those little free libraries. I'm putting all my extra copies of, you know, Alison Bechdel. And I think that actually matters. Have libraries on every street corner. Each one of us can put up a little birdhouse and stuff it with banned books.
And read to people, you know, Pew Trust. I know, you know, everybody here is like, probably, you know, reading these statistics because you're all writers, is that, you know, what Pew has told us recently is that people who, if they've graduated from high school or college, the average adult does not read a full book after that. We read all the time because, you know, we read on our phones and our handhelds. But in terms of, you know, like there's something that's different. Like for us in libraries, we think, you know, the trifecta is not just access, but it's also interpretation and then application, right? It's AIA, right? And so one thing I want to say is that, you know, let's normalize reading to each other. Let's normalize, you know, having banned book clubs, but for writers to read your work. When people come to a book signing, however many people come, or an author signing, what they're also coming for is to hear the writer talk about their work. Go to a library and say, look, I've written this book and I'd be happy to come and speak about it. And I would say, and also normalize, like Nasi, I know you read this book, but read to people. One of the things that made Harry Potter such a success, I always talk about this, in our field, is that it was a book that people read aloud to each other. We have to go back to reading aloud to each other and having more adult programs in libraries, little free libraries, all of that. I mean, you're making me so excited because you have your finger on the pulse. Let's go back also. And Lisa's really, a lot of you all, I'm looking at the chat, are part of this. And I also want to call out Adam Bush, who is, College Unbound president, but really became very active in the work that we were doing in library standards for people who are incarcerated and detained. He brought a lot of that intellectual prowess and the way that he's thinking about higher education to that space. But one thing I would definitely say is that let's center the writer and let's center the public intellectual again. Make that person accessible. Bring them back to cafes, back to bookstores, back to the public square. We need you.
Yes, please. And the reading aloud. Adam's here, by the way. Hi, Adam. The reading aloud, it's such a good idea, and it's such a fundamental part of being a human being, to tell someone a story, to read someone a book, to read a poem. My mentor, the great poet Robert Pinsky, also a voice of just tremendous generosity and sort of a deeply democratic person in the most sort of intellectual and powerful sense of the word, always talked about the voice as the instrument of writing and the tongue as the choir, for poets, but also I think for prose writers, it counts as well. So I couldn't agree more. Jackie Leiden is asking about the history of libraries in American life. Jackie's in Wisconsin. She's our Wisconsin chair, and wants to talk about American libraries.
Yes. So that, first of all, there needs to be a whole panel on that, on on the history of American libraries. I've been doing a lot of research about two things: compulsory illiteracy, the ways in which in this country, like who was denied the right to read, right? Who was penalized, and ways that showed up in law. And then I'm also looking at counter resistance efforts towards that to actually set up libraries, in some of those same communities, because reading has been, an outlaw activity, just in the way that it also has been sanctioned. I think that when we look at the proliferation of the public library concept, from private society libraries to public libraries, whether as imagined by Benjamin Franklin with the Free Library of Philadelphia, or the Library of Congress, Jefferson, or the magnets, not just Carnegie, but also Rosenwald, a huge benefactor of public libraries and of library schools, who was Jewish and is sometimes not mentioned in the same breath as Carnegie, but should be. Kellogg, Rockefeller, there was this notion that that reading and a reading life and ideation actually was critical to, at that time, American productivity and to the achievement of quality. That this idea of self-examination and reflection and learning, lifelong learning as a pursuit, actually contributed to our overall productivity. And now let's look at, the fact that we've defaulted again to when a lot of libraries were being established, public libraries were being established. In some communities, you might have had 2 or 3 out of 5 adults who had very limited literacy, weren't able to read past the 3rd or 5th grade level. Let's look at today. In many of our post-industrial communities, our Rust Belt communities are, where there's a lot of not just new immigrants, but also a lot of generational poverty, and in certain pockets of the South, we also are now returned to places where at least 2 out of 5, if not more, adults have low literacy. So somewhere the impulse that founded the public library, there's been a lot of deterioration, and our labor motives have changed, right? So we're now reliant more on unskilled labor and gray sector labor. And so now we see efforts to defund and decenter public libraries. So I think those of us who are really interested in livable wages and in agency, like personal agency and other types, economic agency and mobility, we have to see the public library as the conduit and as the institution that represents those ideals.
So powerful and smart and useful. I mean, Jackie's pointing out in the chat, and I think it's true, and it connects back to our conversation about telling the stories of the work librarians are actually doing and telling people what censorship actually means. Learning about the history of libraries, such as you're saying, would counter the Moms for Liberty narrative as well. That these are positive and productive counter narratives to the narratives which are damaging our right as free people to read freely. Speaking of as free people, I want to go back for a moment. Adam, I see your note in the chat. I want to go back for a moment to the question of getting books into spaces for human beings who are incarcerated. Adam says work the ALA is leading around rebuilding standards for libraries in prison. I want to just say the words Prison Neighborhood Arts Project out loud in the space because they're doing such good work this way. And they have a lot of us, including me, in the prison, in Stateville teaching. And watching the students at Stateville connect to books is one of the most meaningful experiences of my adult life as a professor, as a teacher, as a human, as a writer. And I want more. I want more books and, University Without Walls and Midwestern Books. What is ALA doing and how can we help?
Yeah, so one is that I think what Adam is alluding to is that we have had to really grapple with the fact that over the years since the first iteration of the standards for library services for people who are incarcerated, we've seen the rise of mass incarceration. And, we've really seen the rise, of course, of the carceral state. And we've seen, we've come to a norm where, over 2% of the population has been incarcerated at some time in their lives. So we definitely have become, a carceral state. And so we had to revamp our standards, to address that reality. And the fact that if we are really dedicated to the for all part of our mission, that we really had to understand reentry and opportunities also to look at generational incarceration and try to interrupt it. One is to restore libraries in prison. So ALA, our public policy and advocacy team, really led a lot of work with Emmanuel Cleaver and others from the state of Missouri and a lot of the Congressional Black Caucus members to introduce the Prison Libraries Act, which, if it is passed, would allow prisons to apply for grants that would restore libraries or create libraries for the first time. Also provide educational services, which have a lot of times have lapsed on a formal basis in prison settings, and also to support people who are re-entering and having some type of digital skills. Because a lot of times I teach I teach some classes sometimes for people who are re-entering, and it's an information literacy course. And many times, if somebody's been incarcerated for 10, 13, 20 years, the things that we take for granted about digital literacy and digital access, they can't, and they haven't been exposed to that. So that would bring at least $60 million to prisons over the next 6 years if it's passed. So ALA is working on that level, our standards, but also, to your point, really looking at how do we intervene in prison visiting rooms? Because a lot of times, and I've, been there, many of us have, visiting family members, and especially as a young kid, there was nothing to do. You just sat and maybe got something from the vending machine, talk to your loved one through the plexiglass. But what we're asking ourselves is how can those spaces be reimagined as learning centers, as places for family literacy? And this is something we can, work on together. But that's one thing that we are, and a lot of programs like that, that we are working on. And another project that we're working on is also how do we sort of codify creative writing and learning programs in prisons across the board, so that it's not just in like rich in Illinois and in New York and places where you might have a lot of writers and a lot of activists who, are willing to do this work, but also in places where people are still organizing. So we're really trying to work, I think, on a systems level, but also on a programmatic level.
Again, I just want to like echo what you're saying about the kind of a constellation of repression, because I think mass incarceration is a giant planet in that constellation of repression, and our students are without access to basic educational materials, including books, and unless there are just enormous amounts of work done by fabulous organizations like ALA and like PNAP, the Prison Neighborhood Arts Program Project, and so on.
Of
course, PEN America, exactly.
America, yeah. One thing that when we did our hearings for the library standards for people who are incarcerated, the way that ALA works is that you can't create a new standard unless you hear from you get the lived experiences and testimonials of people who are experiencing the information need, right? So we had our first session was people who had just recently been incarcerated. We had the voices before of people who are incarcerated, but one person just spoke to everything, and people were just like holding back like tears. They were saying, after being incarcerated for over 20 years, that the thing they most look forward to was the book cart. And the prison had over time restricted the kinds of books that people could have access to until there was only about 13. And that those people who read books would just pray. The individual said, I would just pray sometimes that it would be a book that I hadn't already read 20 times. Can you imagine? Right? Just where it is the same group of books and you're just hoping, right, that it might be a book that you only read 8 or 9 times. Information repression is real. And if we want to see censorship in action, prisons are the place where censorship has become normative and normalized. It is, yeah.
Mitch, I have to tie this back too to the idea of replacing school libraries with detention facilities, because even the architecture of that idea suggests incarceration rather than freedom, rather than access. Mitch Kaplan has dropped in the chat Exchange for Change, which is a group bringing books, writing, and voice to the incarcerated in South Florida. So maybe we can come up after this conversation with a list of resources for people who want to be helpful. I think of one of my students at Stateville read Claudia Rankine's Citizen.
Yeah.
And said after reading it that it allowed him to see himself for the first time in 20 years and to grieve the loss of his father. And he had felt prior to reading Citizen that he couldn't see himself and that he didn't have permission to grieve.
Yeah.
And I just feel like it's one granular anecdote in a just endless mosaic of these kinds of experiences where books let us live. They let us be human. And so all the way from the littlest kids who are not having access to books to the oldest grandparents, either incarcerated or in neighborhoods where there just isn't access, we need to use every resource that we have. I feel like we have a lot of collective resources in this room. Yeah. And in our universities and in our houses and in our own communities, let's fight. Let's be loud. Let's be loud and organized, as you said. Yes. And let's not assume that someone else is fighting.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and bring the institutions that we work for, like bring them to the table. Yeah. I mean, animate them, right? Yeah, definitely. Right here, in this group, if we wanted to move on this issue today, we could, because we have the kind of minds and the thinkers and relationships. I think what I'm interested in is knowing what I can do to support Writers for Democratic Action. The writers piece is the operative, and like there is that Harper's Bazaar article from 1867 that I always hold on to. It says the alphabet is an abolitionist, and what people were arguing was, like, what was going to happen now post, quote unquote, the Emancipation Proclamation about the education of people of color. And what they were saying is that to move towards abolition necessitates a type of common base or level or foundation for at least education or literacy, because what else is what is the other solution? I mean, you have to have, a group of people. To be free is to be, in many ways, is to have a certain level of literacy and a certain level of, I would say, civic literacy and civic fluency. And I think that's what we're talking about when we look at writers for democratic action. You've put together words that in and of themselves places an onus on this group. Right? Because the democratic action piece here, that's under siege. It's like us with our mission. Our mission places us in a point where not only are we embattled, but we have to fight back,
I can't imagine a more beautiful place to land. And as humble and generous as you are, I also know that you're in unbelievable demand, and it's 7 p.m. in Chicago. So I'm going to wrap it up. I'm going to thank you profusely for your brilliance and your energy and all the work that you're doing, and for coming in and talking to us tonight. You guys can watch this over and over. See it again and again, better than cats. Just click back on the same link you clicked to get in, or check out WDA's website and follow Tracie's work in the world.
Thank you all so much. And thank you, Chief Lee. Thank you so much for having me.
A great joy.